Lisa Sharland, thank you very much for joining us. You've recently worked for the Australian mission to the UN in New York, and also last week you wrote an excellent post for The Strategist on Australia's engagement with the UN Security Council. Can you speak a little bit about Australia's engagement on the UN over the last 18 months?
Thanks, Hayley. I think what we've seen is when Australia took up its seat on the Security Council on the 1st of January 2013, there were a lot of questions about what Australia's priorities were going to be, what we were going to set out to achieve on the 2-year term while we were there. And I think what we've seen evolve over those last 18 months has depended on sort of what our responsibilities were and also what events we've seen happening around the world. First and foremost, there were responsibilities that Australia was aware of when we took up our seat. These included holding the pen on Afghanistan, which effectively means that as one of the non-permanent members, Australia had responsibility for issuing council products with regards to what the UN was doing in Afghanistan and how events were unfolding. And what has resulted there is we've seen the adoption of 2 resolutions reauthorising the UN presence there over the last 18 months. We also knew coming onto the council that we'd have responsibility for 3 sanctions regimes. So they were on Al-Qaeda, the Taliban and Iran. And effectively what that means is several of the non-permanent council members have responsibility for one of more than a dozen sanctions regimes that the council has mandated. So holding chairmanship of that means regular meetings, monitoring implementation, a whole range of processes that go along with that. What we've also seen in terms of what was planned for is a series of priorities, issues that Australia had a particular interest in seeing carried out. These had to do with how effectively peacekeeping operations were mandating the protection of civilians on the ground, the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, how the council goes about conflict prevention, greater transparency of the council, so sort of the implementation of a range of different issues where Australia has traditionally had some level of interest. But I think most recently what we've seen is that Australia has been most effective in areas that perhaps we couldn't have planned for or expected on the council. And one of those has been the issue of humanitarian access in Syria, and also, as we've seen in the last few weeks, the approach to the downing of MH17.
Yes, you write about that in your blog. Do you want to speak a little bit more about those 2 resolutions and how instrumental Australia was in bringing those to conclusion?
I think if we look at the situation in Syria, what we've really seen is a number of the permanent council members hold the pen on situations of particular priority. And Australia, along later with Luxembourg and Jordan when they came onto the council, have undertaken sort of a very active diplomacy as non-permanent members to address that particular aspect of what's happening in Syria right now in terms of humanitarian access. We've seen this evolve over the last 18 months with the adoption of a presidential statement in 2013, the adoption of Resolution 2139 earlier this year, and when that wasn't effectively being implemented, we've seen the adoption of Resolution 2165 in July. And what that has mandated is the authorisation of humanitarian access delivery through 4 different border crossings without the consent of the Syrian government. So that was quite a significant development, one that was carefully navigated, I think, in terms of the politics, because as you may be aware, we've seen Russia and China previously veto 4 different resolutions with regards to what's been happening in Syria over the last few years. So the hope is certainly that that will improve or deliver, I think, humanitarian access anywhere upwards of to 2 million people on the ground. And the council is expected to receive reporting on that every 30 days. With regards to MH17, I think in terms of the advocacy of this government, it was seen as a mechanism to pursue, I think, international agreement with the ability to have an independent investigation or access to the site on the ground. And I think the ability of Australia to bring about that resolution without some of the effort that had already been undertaken in the last 18 months to develop some capital in the council would have been quite difficult. So I think both those events are something that can be pointed to as areas where Australia's been able to make some progress.
Now, Lisa, we're already in August, and that means we've entered the final quarter of Australia's term on the council. What can we expect from Australia in this final quarter?
I think one of the things to point out is, having already served 18 months, there are a couple of factors that are in our benefit. First of all, we have a better understanding of how the council actually operates. And it's quite a complex organisation. For a country such as Australia, which had only previously, the last time we'd served had been 1986, where the council had a lot less work on its agenda. It meets almost on a daily, if not more than daily basis in terms of the work it's currently undertaking. The processes are quite difficult to sort of understand in terms of being able to navigate them. So I think we have that understanding now. We've developed some political capital in terms of the way that we work with other council members and how they've seen us effectively work. And that's also, I think, extended into some of the personal relationships that we've seen amongst the people working on the council. So with those factors, I think what we're going to see over the next quarter is continued pressure on the issue of humanitarian access in Syria and how that's being effectively implemented, how the issue of addressing the access to the site where MH17 came down, I think will remain a bit of an unknown and will really depend on events on the ground. But the resolution that was adopted leaves open there some UN action in terms of how they might seek to be engaged if that is indeed the case. Other areas that I think we're going to see Australia engaging in terms of will have to do with Afghanistan, and there are questions around whether the council will authorise another mandate in terms of what's going to happen for the non-UN deployment that's in country right now post-2014. And similarly, on the issue of sanctions, as I mentioned before, Australia chairs 3 sanctions regimes. One of the activities that Australia's also been engaged in is a high-level review on sanctions and how the UN might more comprehensively address the way that they're being implemented, because sanctions aren't necessarily seen as the most interesting topic of the Council, but they're one of the very many tools that they use to enforce the work that's being undertaken. In addition to those issues, things that are coming up in the next 6 months that we need to watch out for will include the deployment of the UN mission in the Central African Republic and how that's going, and that's expected to deploy on the 15th of September. And also the dire situation that we see in South Sudan right now. The mandate for the current UN peacekeeping mission there that remains under-deployed is up for renewal in November. So I think they are going to be situations of interest given the level of engagement we've had on peacekeeping whilst we've been there.
Australia has a lot on its plate at the moment.
That would be pretty fair to say.
Yes,
yeah.
And then in November again, Australia has the presidency of the UN Security Council. How do you see Australia using this second opportunity to hold the presidency?
Well, it's quite an enviable opportunity to have a second presidency on the council, and it really comes about by chance. It's an alphabetical rotation. So the last presidency we held was in September last year. It was politically quite an interesting time because we had, in terms of our domestic politics, an election taking place, and it's also the month where you have several high-level events taking place in New York. But Australia was successful in seeking the adoption of the first ever resolution on small arms and light weapons. So I think this November, one of the advantages of having the presidency is while there is a very fixed agenda of briefings and meetings that you don't have any influence over, you do have the ability to identify a handful of issues that you might take forward. And we've heard suggestions that policing in the context of peacekeeping might be an issue that Australia is going to look at. And I think if that were the case, that would be quite interesting. It's not something the Council's focused on. We see an increasing acknowledgement that peacekeeping missions need more effective security sector reform and particularly policing expertise. So it'll be quite interesting to see what issues Australia chooses to focus on, but that would certainly be one of interest.
Mm. And I mean, Australia has only a few months left on the Council. In your view, what do you think Australia should be focusing on in its last couple of months, and what responsibilities do you think Australia has in this remaining time?
I think in terms of the remaining council agenda, it will be maintaining the pace and meeting expectations of what's been set the last 18 months in terms of taking that forward through the end of December. I think the important issue that the government needs to start considering is how we're going to continue the engagement in terms of the benefits that we've received from that council term. And this includes things such as we've seen our understanding of particular contexts and deepening of our diplomatic engagement on situations that are on the council's agenda, such as Africa, to ensure that knowledge and understanding perhaps isn't lost. Similarly, we've seen, I think, an enhanced level of engagement with a number of our partners and allies, and even with countries such as Russia and China in terms of the way that we effectively have engaged as a council member. So how do we capture those lessons and apply them, I think, more broadly to our diplomatic engagement will remain an ongoing question. I think the other issue in terms of consideration when we come off the council will be when do we consider perhaps running again? And I think this requires a comprehensive look at, where our interests are best served within the UN system and within the UN Security Council. And I think what we've seen over the last couple of months while we've been serving, and particularly more recently the last month, is that while Australia's interests perhaps aren't always affected by the Council agenda, there's no doubt that we do have an interest in what it's doing, whether it be in terms of security, in particular contexts in the world, or particular aspects of how it's carrying out its implementation. So I think one of the questions going forward will be, how we look to do that in the near future. It's probably not a question that they want to be looking at right now, but it's something that certainly needs to be considered as we start to look at how we come off the Council.
Definitely. It sounds like Australia has a lot of considerations. Well, Lisa, thank you very much for your time. It's been very fascinating.
No, thank you, Hayley.